Well, I guess while Joe is taking care of this, I can project and do my quick introductions. Greetings, everyone. Good morning. My name is Malik Williams. I am a master's candidate in the dual degree in architecture and community planning. And this thesis I'll be presenting today is the urban disconnect. Urban co-housing is the solutions for social isolation.
Check, check.
There we go. Sorry. At this time, I'd like to thank all of the esteemed guests for coming out today. Appreciate all of you. I'd also like to thank my thesis committee for all of your wonderful work and support. And of course, my thesis cohort who were all there with me during the long nights leading up to this presentation. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, the agenda for today is really simple, 4 parts. First, we're going to begin with an introduction and brief information about the theory behind the project. Then we're going to transition into what is urban co-housing and how can we achieve it. Then we'll move on to a case study, which we take the principles of urban co-housing and apply them in a real context. And then we'll conclude with a brief virtual tour and presentation of a day in the life of residents. And then we'll open it up for further discussion and questions. So this thesis started off with an idea, a feeling, a question. How often do we feel alone, even or disconnected from others? This feeling is something that for many of us is a fairly common experience. And so much so that over the last decade, numerous publications from scholars and researchers around the world have indicated that loneliness is not just a feeling that we have, it's an actual epidemic. Vivek Murthy, former Surgeon General, identified it as one of the greatest issues to public health in America. The American Psychological Association says that it's even worse than obesity. But this issue isn't just a health implication, it is a sign of a greater issue, and that greater issue is the collapse of community around the world. Robert Putnam talks about this in his book, Bowling Alone, The Collapse of Community and the Revival of American Society. And he identifies the decline of civic participation and social engagement as one of the key features in that. Now, all this is to say, it sounds pretty bleak, but there's hope. As early as the 1950s, the Danes had a wonderful idea called cohousing, a social movement which was gathered around bringing people together and creating a community life that was focused on interaction and engagement. Giving up on these ideas of traditional privacy and individual ownership, but thinking about a way that individuals can relate to one another in a more sustainable and communal way. So, what does co-housing look like? On the board here, we have 2 images. On the left, the first generation of co-housing, which is more reminiscent of co-housing's beginnings in the early 1950s, and then co-housing a little bit after it's been transported around the world. So the key elements from here that we can take away is co-housing is a collective organization of private households. We can see each home has its own character and maintains its own identity and unique elements. However, it's all a part of a complete package and a collage of different community. The center focus of the project and what makes it uniquely co-housing is the common house, which is the center for community life. The common house is a community-owned building, a place where residents come and enjoy each other. Inside common houses, we find programs such as communal kitchens, communal living and dining rooms that share dinners and lunch, community. Sorry, my voice is a little dry. community offices, shared gyms, tool shops so individuals don't have to have 40 lawnmowers for 40 houses. All this is a part of this social network that's created to promote exchange, interaction, and social cohesion. And then finally, this whole mosaic of homes is centered around a common green space where individuals come out and enjoy the public realm. And users sit along and watch residents from their porches and talk. And as residents pass through the community, they're always in complete contact with the common green. And so, as we move forward with urban cohousing, we'll see some of these elements return. So the problem with cohousing is that traditionally it is a suburban home, a suburban typology. Its many flaws is that its many critics is that it's been mostly agrarian, and that's why it hasn't grown in popular demand. It's also been limited to scales of 16 to 32 houses. But as we know today, the world is becoming more and more urbanized, and so the question for architects and for planners is, how do we thank you so much. Excuse me. He's good for it. How do we make this transition from a suburban environment to an urban realm? So first, we have to look at the community scale. How can we make communities that are both sustainable environmentally, economically, but also socially? How do we get individuals to feel like they're a part of something, even when there might not be anything there at the time? How do we create community? And so, looking deeper, from research, Woodcraft and Brundtland produced 4 dimensions of social sustainability. The first being social infrastructure and amenities. A community must have the resources there to strive, whether that's parks, public transit, even sidewalks. All these are essential to creating a sense of place and a sense of belonging. Space to grow. As communities change over time, the built environment must adapt to the needs and uses that are most important. Social and cultural life. A community has to have its own identity while also be able to allow for others to come in and create opportunities for change and interaction. And then lastly, voice and influence. How can communities allow residents to make changes to their own landscape and express themselves? And so with these 4 dimensions of social sustainability, we can then boil them, decipher them into a number of principles based off of my own literature review, as well as my own time studying co-housing locally in Maryland. So of those principles I've outlined here in the center, we can see a number of them, such as proximity to goods and services, balance in public-private space, as well as accessibility and connectivity. We can then translate those into architectural outcomes and physical and spatial outcomes. The main 5 being a central common house where individuals can interact, pedestrian streets that have high visibility and allow users to pass and interact with each other, a common green space for individuals to gather and collect and engage and organize, and then a mixture of unit types and tenure to increase diversity and allow for a variety of uses and housing. So now we're going to move on to the third part of the presentation, where we're going to talk about, where I'm going to introduce you to the case study, the Whedon Art Collective. So for those of you who are not familiar with Whedon is about 9.3 miles from right here in the architecture building. It's north of Silver Spring, Maryland, and about a 10-15 minute drive from the DC borderline. Whedon, the central business district, is identified here, but I'm going to be focusing mostly here on the city of Whedon, where we have the Whedon metro station, red line for you locals. And as we zoom into the city, we can see that the central business district, which is the border, which is essentially outlined by the black line, is comprised of a pretty interesting mix of commercial as well as residential and retail spaces. Most importantly to note is that Wheaton is one of 2 cities in Montgomery County, Maryland, one of 115 in the state that are designated as an arts and entertainment district, which means that it gets certain benefits from the state for projects that improve upon, that capitalize on arts and entertainment ventures. Our site is located here in the red dash site, a block away from the existing metro station. And lastly, to note, we can also see in Wheaton that there is a stark lack of green public spaces. As we can see, that most of the major spaces mostly lie on the outside, with a very small portion right at the right north of the metro station, which is currently next to a parking garage. Wheaton, one of the greatest elements of Wheaton is that it is truly a multicultural metropolis, housing many different, housing a diverse population of individuals and many assets and many forms. So, the median age is about 36, so it's a fairly young city, but it has many households, about 3.2 persons per average household. And we can see some of the building typologies in this graph, both native and foreign-born residents. So looking closely at the site, the existing site is the Fitzgerald Auto Dealership. It's currently, like I said, it's 1 block away from the metro station, and the site is 92,000 square feet, about 2.1 acres. We can kind of see from the aerial visuals that across the site, moving from Georgia Avenue on the west to Amherst Avenue on the east, there's a notable drop, 26 feet of grade change over 200 feet. So that's important to know. But one of the biggest things about this project is that this site is directly at the transition point between the growing urban center of Wheaton and the residential community. And so when looking at this design, we have to think of it from the lens of how does this project relate both to the urban center and the community that's growing there, to the existing community and the residential neighborhood that currently exists, and how can we adapt and change as the city continues to grow. Because at the current state, as of 2012, this site is slotted for an FAR of 5 out of 92,000 square feet. So that's an allotted 4,600 square feet of density and a height limit of 150. So you can get a sense just from how the planning department is looking at this site that this city is intended to grow, and quite fast actually. So quickly, the program brief is very simple. It's a mixed-use residential apartment complex with 90% condominiums and 10% rental units. That's fairly typical for co-housing communities. On the ground floor, we have commercial office space, as well as institutional spaces for the community around it, and then a number of additional open spaces to add to the variety of public spaces in Wheaton. Now let's meet some of the residents of the Wheaton Art Collective. On the left, we have Sophia and Avery. Sophia is a mother and a chef, and she works at a local bakery. In the daytime, she works at the local bakery, but while her son stays at the community daycare where he does arts crafts. Jillian and Lucas are a couple who are musicians and aspiring superstars. They love Wheaton because of the nightlife, but they enjoy. Matt Thais is a graphic designer. He does work for Georgetown University, and also teaches a graphic design class for residents on weekends. And then Carmen's an investigative journalism who works in DC, and she also has 4 dogs and she loves it. So this is the Weed and Art Collective. Certain things to note, we can see that it's a composition of 4 individual buildings, part of an entire complex. One 16-story high-rise tower, 2 7-story mid-rise buildings, and then a 4-story 2-over-2 garden apartment. And together they form a central courtyard, which creates the true public realm and we front on 4 sides as we've introduced a new pedestrian street along the boundary line between the existing property line. So this is the site plan, and some interesting notes about the site plan. It's a combined site plan, so it is a composition of the ground planes at 2 levels as well as the central space. And so if we look on the board to my modestly sized plan, all the portion that is here is at that plus 26 foot grade, which directly relates to Georgia Avenue that runs north-south. On the sides, it comes down to 26 feet, and we're at 0 where we have the low rise, and the low rise meets there. And then everything in the center here in this kind of gray zone is a 16 feet below that. So it's plus 26, 16, 0 as we kind of go across the site from west to east. And so now we're going to go through the individual floor plans after we talk about the program itself. As I mentioned, the program is stacked vertically with commercial and retail at the bottom, and then community spaces and some of the larger public areas wrapped around the center common space. And then moving upwards, we have the residential above the 3rd floors. So, let's go. So, we start here at the garage level, at level 0. This is the first level where we begin, where the low-rise residential directly relates out to the public street. You can enter in from the garage on the lower half, and then pull directly into your low-rise apartment, or if you're in one of the mid-rises of the tower, you can go up through the stairwell, or there's also a center elevator that brings you up to the central plaza level, which we see here. So this again is the lower plaza level at 10 feet above grade from Amherst Avenue. Those garden apartments that started on the ground floor now enter out and have their front porches that directly relate to the courtyard and plaza. And on the north side, we have an exhibit space and a tool shop, a community workshop where resident artists can exhibit their own works, as well as hold public events and public gallery showings, but also can work in the tool shop and work on their next craft and their next project. On the south side, we have community studios and classroom spaces. So these are envisioned to be spaces where resident artists can work work on their own projects, whether it's pottery, cooking, graphic design, but then they can also invite residents, community members from outside into the project and help hold classroom spaces. And so it's a multifunctional use and can be used throughout the day. We have public spaces such as a large multi-purpose room, which can be used for large, complex-wise community dividends, or even voter registration, if that's what Whedon needs at the time. Or there's also a tucked-in media center for residents to have classes on digital fabrication, digital design, and then there's group fitness rooms and gyms on the lower half. Bike rooms right directly underneath the stairs. And moving up. So now we're at plus 26 at grade with Georgia Avenue again. We now see we now can reach the upper terrace, which has a direct relation to the artist vendor spaces on the north, as well as the artist lounge, which is so the whole community's floor on the north is open to that. including with a performance theater at the very black box theater. On the south side, we have cafes and a WeWork space. So members of the residents as well as the greater community can come in and do work. If Sophia's working on maybe her job interview skills, she can take her kids downstairs to get a class while she's working and doing conference calls. And then while Carm's waiting on her email back from her boss, who wants to know when she's going to make that next deadline, she can sit at the commercial restaurant, which has direct lights on the terrace upstairs. Up on the plaza. And then again on the set, we see on the garden apartments, we see the second tier of the garden apartments coming to rise. We have that first open walkway that looks directly out on the courtyard, as well as the beginning of our common house. So we can see that. Moving up, we see this is now at the 4th level, which is our typical floor plan. So moving up in both the middle rise and the high rise, we see a mix. We see all the residential units are through units, single loaded. So all the residents walk along the exterior courtyard, which is the exterior walkway, which faces the courtyard, and along those different paths we have collaborative cubes where residents can come in and take over the space and adapt to their needs. So whether that is to hold a birthday party in one day, or to set up as a lighting, camera studio for photography, or whether it's to have a rock jam session, they can go in at any time and use the space however they need it, or it can just also be a lounge space, which has a direct view to the public park yard. We can see there's a mix of units, both in both in singles, efficiencies, 2-bedroom units, and double units. And so now we move on to the longitudinal section. So we can see clearly on the boards, we can see that 26-foot grade change from the Georgia Avenue side down through the plaza, and then terracing again to Amherst. We can see the vertical circulation moving up from the ground floor all the way up, and we can see those creative cues really extending and engaging the public space. We can see now in the transverse section, we can see that again, how we cut through the center courtyard space. We now get a really good view of that central terrace level, and then the communal spaces of the tower that ribbon from the ground floor all the way to the top 16th floor. So, as I mentioned before, in cohousing, there is a certain number that constrains the design. It is about 16 to 32 units that a cohousing community is adjusted for, so that every person within that unit in that community knows each other and has a sense of relationship to that person. So I've taken that idea and I've taken it as an urban sense and saying that every 2 floors has about 16 to 32 units, and these stacked communities, or which I'm calling clusters, are how every floor plate works. And so if we go back to the interior program diagram, we can see that each cluster in the tower is associated. So units in this one cluster share this common space, which is tiered, and so on. It has 2 different levels, and users can move in individually. But then they're all connected vertically, and so residents from the top floor can easily go down to the bottom floor and engage and interact with each other. And there's community dispersed throughout the entire project, and not just at the top and at the bottom or across the complex. This is supposed to be an idea that there's community at multiple levels everywhere, and that users have the ability to freely move throughout it. And so we can kind of see here in the screen again the different kind of scales of community interaction. We have the large patio courtyard space for whole cluster interaction. But then we have common houses for maybe smaller, 20 to 25 people interactions, where you have your kitchen and your residents can come and drink coffee while their children are upstairs running around the children's room. And then at the very end, we see a smaller space, the creative cube, which you can have to just sit and have popcorn and watch a movie, or even just enjoy their own time. So I talked a lot about community, and I know for some of us, we really want to know, well, Malik, you're giving out so much community space. How are we making money? We have to sell units to make space. So we do this by prioritizing, by rethinking our priorities. In co-housing, the community has to rank, is the most important. So what we do is, by downsizing in some of the private amenities, we give square footage over to the public. We give square footage to the communal resources. And so these residents are looking for more interaction, so they're gonna take, all right, I'll have an efficiency unit, or maybe a smaller apartment where I don't need a full-size kitchen. Maybe I have a smaller kitchenette and a modest living space, because I know that I can go down the hall to the common house and I can share with my friends, and we have the super 96-inch television, and we have the pool table, or they have more variety, so they're reducing on their own size. And so everywhere throughout the program, we are reducing private spaces while increasing public spaces. And then last, we're going to the virtual tour. So here's that view from the common spaces from the tower. So we can see residents engaging at breakfast time, having some mimosas, and looking out onto the public courtyard space, reading the newspaper, having their cup of coffee. And then downstairs on the terrace, we have an arts and crafts festival where residents are sharing their goods and selling them to the local community, and people are outside enjoying and walking their dogs. Up here in the Creative Cube, we have a group of residents who are preparing for their next gig downtown, where they're just doing some little practice recording. And then here in the lower plaza, we can see residents enjoying the wonderful public space, whether that's frisbee on the green lawn, or running through the fountain area, the fountain sculpture garden. And then a small jazz concert where artists are going out and performing and actually taking advantage of the space and using it, whether it's just for enjoyment or maybe to make a quick dollar. And then lastly, a game night in a multi-purpose room, really inviting the community from all of the complex and even the greater Wheaton Conscience to come down and enjoy time together and share in interaction. And so as I stated before in the very beginning, to make a socially sustainable community, you really have to have 4 elements. That's the social infrastructure, the space to grow, a strong social and cultural life, and an ability to influence and change the space. And so in all these ways, we've done that architecturally, whether it's the creative cube that allows you to adapt the space for whatever you need, a large community green to hold community events and have community concerts, being directly located to public transit and having the resources allow you to have the type of easy, comfortable lifestyle that you want, or having a connection through open walkways where you have visual relation with everyone else. We've done all these things, and now we've created a community that's really active, vibrant, and socially engaged. And so, before I open it up to continue discussion, I'd like to just quickly go through the boards and kind of tell you how I've laid them out. We have the community scale on the first 2 panels, then the building scale, and then lastly the human scale.
I think we can understand how you break it down.
Thank you.
I want to give the panel.
Yep, and so now I'd like to open up to the panel.
Malik, this is a terrific project. Wheaton needs it. Wheaton is struggling to become a place, as you know. And we have
Plenty of experts who are going to talk about
the relationship between unit size and collective space, which is happening naturally anyway with micro units and so on, but which you've articulated, I think, quite nicely here. My question is this. Altogether, this adds up to a community itself, a bigger community, so it's a scalar breakdown. The only community space that I could detect was called a game room, I think. Do you see a place here for the entire community, the collection of co-housing communities, to express a collective function of some sort? Self-governance, whatever, because I suspect this will become a condominium, essentially a condominium of the entire.
Correct. So that's a wonderful question. So there's a number of, so when I was designing this project, I was really looking at community at 4 different scales. The community at the Wheaton Grander area, the city of Wheaton, the community within the complex, the community within the building, and then the community within the clusters. And so there's different, so at every level I've tried my best to create different levels of community spaces where you can engage. So at the large community scale, including Wheaton and the existing the surrounding residents, those spaces are mostly a part of the public realm, whether it's the exhibit spaces, the community workshops, vendor spaces, a lot of those ground floor amenities and public retail spaces, including, if I could click all the way back, to underneath the upper terrace there we go, we'll go with this one. Underneath our upper terrace, that giant multi-purpose room. So that could be something that's used by the entire 4 buildings, whether it's to have a giant town hall meeting to talk about the status of weed art, or maybe to talk about how we need to make sure that, or how everyone needs to make sure that we put all the tools back in the right place, to having, as I mentioned before, even voter registration. In the actual buildings, we have community spaces, the common houses, and the outdoor terraces. So that's for building interaction, and then smaller interactions again are those individual creative cubes. And so going through this project, I thought very deeply about the different levels of interaction, going from the individual to the city, and how those places can interact in their relation to the courtyard. Yes.
So, I think excellent work. There's aspects of your project that I find well crafted and well thought out, but at the same time, perhaps maybe because of how well you've crafted something, it sort of leaves you open for some questions. I was actually interested in you defining what community means to you vis-a-vis those demographics of those people that you showed, which are primarily professional people. I don't see the mother that works at Safeway. I actually grew up in Wheaton around this neighborhood. I don't see the mother with 3 kids that works at Safeway across the street. How does she fit into this demographics? You also said it's primarily condominiums, but when you define community, you're looking at a variety of building types. Where does a rental come in? Where does a low income component come in? And how does it all work together? And I would ask you to, maybe after this, look at some other examples that have done this, not because they're looking to create a new social construct, but they're sort of forced to do it just based on scarcity of land. So if you look at some Dutch examples, for example, in Amsterdam, where they have these 40 islands that they created in the 90s, that because of the scarcity of land, whatever development they have to mix all those demographic types and make them work seamlessly where everybody gets along. So it filters from the street edge across Amherst, where I was hoping you actually cut a site section that then cuts into the neighborhood. Not a building site section, but that extends across Amherst, that grabs that neighborhood across the street. Because what I love about your project is the sectional sort of scale, that you go from the residence, the sort of single family across the street, it goes into this typology across the street, and then it builds up towards Georgia Avenue, which is much more active. But I wanted to see that porosity. How do people across the street engage this? You sort of made this tree line component and I apologize if I'm jumping around, but I also want to get all the points in. This street as almost like a residential scale street, how does it relate to what's across the street in terms of the typology across the street? And then you sort of transition in, and I wonder if there's a level of porosity in this block that allows that sort of pulling this in into your middle courtyard, as opposed to like a wall that says standoff. Because again, that's why I asked you, what does community mean to you? Like, does it mean just this localized entity where they sort of create their own sort of fiefdom and they say stand out, especially if they're condominiums, they're not going to share those spaces. There's going to be a gate that says, we pay for this. Condo fees pay to maintain this standoff. Do your thing across the street. So I want you to sort of elaborate on that, on what community means to you.
I think that's an excellent question. That's something that me and my committee discuss a lot. It's something we discuss in planning class a lot. Community for me is a gathering of people with a shared value of some sort. There's a connection between them that brings them all together. And so in this project, it might be money, but in this project, it was artists. The user demographic were artists, artisan people. And so that's what brings the people who live in the building together. But it's also how Wheaton comes together. Wheaton is an arts district. It is a very rich cultural life, and I wanted to take art and use it as a catalyst to bring the extended Wheaton community. So in my own theory and research, it's really hard to define community at one level because we understand that we have as humans, we have multiple dimensions of our interactions with residents. We have relationships with people at our work, people at home, people in family, and so your level of community changes with who you're interacting with. And so the way I try to mitigate that is by creating spaces and opportunity for different levels of interaction across different community boundaries. And so looking at the architecture, part of this arrangement was not only to create a kind of sense of frontage on the four sides, but also to create a building that had a central binding element, which is that central plaza courtyard space. But then I wanted to divide them and physically create barriers, and by breaking them into 4 individual elements to allow for residents to come in through each corner. And then as we treat the corners, especially the corners where most of the community members is, the people from Wheaton and the metro station, the buildings are slightly turned away and open up and reveal that the entrances into the plaza. And then equally so on the lower half. On the lower half, we've created more pedestrian connections through the neighborhood. To answer your question about what's kind of here, to the north, we have existing row house, kind of typical row house typology, and so that's really kind of the inspiration of how the garden units were created. Creating that idea of the same typology and that frontage continuing through, but then allowing passages through. So this path goes into that garage that'll take you up through your central elevator, which some residents might like. I think it's a pretty neat elevator. There's fun arts on it. But then also creating pathways that bring people up, being able to enter in through the side and then enter into our galleries and lobbies. And so I took a lot of time to try to create a building that felt like a complete complex, but then had the ability to be flexible to allow others in too.
So I guess the other part of the demographics is also your program, where, again, as this sort of almost siloed, sort of defensible project that you've created, where are the additional programmatic components that's going to make this thrive? There are, I kept mentioning family, there are mothers with 3 kids that are artists that will live here. Where's the daycare that's going to support them? Do they have to go across Georgia Avenue to shop? Are there other programmatic components that would actually make this richer, as opposed to like these, banquet halls and meeting rooms that you're thinking people are going to use on a daily basis? What people have busy lives, they might use it once a week as opposed to like every day. So there's some kernel of programmatic elements that I wish you had that would make this even much more richer. For example, these daycares, like, the little mom and pop shop downstairs that is part of the artist initiative.
Right.
That I think would actually make your project even more fantastic. I love how you put the big program on Georgia Avenue, because again, it's a heavy vehicular artery that runs through Wheaton. But I also want to see some kind of retail there that sort of would, just because it's a community for artists doesn't mean you can't attract capital and investment in this project that sort of would help it thrive. But because if it's just dedicated to artists, I'm going to be frank with you, I live in Baltimore in the art district. Most of those people, they're not making six figures, right? They live in communal spaces where they sort of vibe off each other, support each other. They live in communal even spaces. There's this whole movement where the Baltimore city government is like tearing down some of these spaces and developers are taking them over, and the city's up in arms because these artists sort of, they thrive on, basic income, because they're not all going to be successful. I think, again, it goes to the demographics that you're looking at as artists. You're looking at this, the filmmaker and like the dance instructor, but there is also the painter that went to MICA that's trying to, eke out a living, that I think you need to sort of fold into it, and how does that fit into everything that you've constructed, I think is what's missing.
So just to answer that quickly, so I did try to, when I think of artists, I don't want to just narrow it to the typical idea of just, painters, musicians, and whatnot, but I've tried to create spaces that allow for the broader things of artists. So, I mean, we have up here on, this one doesn't work here, up here on the northern edge on the north building, we have additional vendor spaces. If you've ever been to the Anacostia Community Center in DC, it is a arts collective where you have a central lobby, but then there's also vendor spaces inside where local business people can rent out space and have their own storefronts within a smaller venue, which attracts a diverse population of people. And then below on the community garden level, the plaza level, these studio classroom spaces could easily be adapted to a daycare center, and it was part of one of the things that when I was doing my thesis research, it was something I was really proposing, but for the nomenclature, it's identified as just a classroom studio space. But those could be flexible to be either classrooms and studios for small kids, so teaching arts to children and toddlers, to having full adult classes on how to do figurative drawing.
I really like this project. I like the thesis behind it. I like planning aspects behind it. I like that you've got a limited palette of materials and it's expressed slightly differently on each building, but it connects them. You know that this is a community. They relate to each other. I think it's a stronger planning project than it's an architectural project. Your buildings and facades, in my mind, lack a little bit of detail and interest. This is the squattest looking 150-foot tall building in all of Montgomery County, probably. I was surprised when you said it was 150 feet tall. It just doesn't look or feel that way. But, with time you can solve this. I think that there's a lot of good stuff happening here. There's a lot of little things that can get corrected. It's really unfortunate. You have this stairway coming down, separating your exhibit space from your community green, and you've got what looks to be 20 feet of blank brick wall. That's not very friendly. You've got sort of raised sills in these gallery spaces and stuff, and there's no need for that. The glass can come down to the ground. You get more indoor-outdoor. Perhaps they can actually use glass garage doors and they can display art outside on nice days or something. So there's all that stuff. But the part of this that troubles me the most, and which I think get right, is you're linking like every 2 floors, so it's a community at one level, and then you've got these common spaces and stuff that links each building, and then all 4 buildings are linked by the courtyard. It then doesn't link to the community of Wheaton. It's very circle the wagons internal. And it goes back to what you showed at the very beginning when this co-housing was a suburban model, agrarian, and everything turned inward. And I'm troubled by not holding the geometry of Georgia Avenue and creating more of a pedestrian-friendly Georgia Avenue, because Ralph is right, we need a lot of help. This pedestrian street, other than to get somewhere faster, there's nothing along it that would really make you want to go there. There's a grade change. Why not work it out so that these classrooms and studio windows more directly, provide an active, interesting thing to walk along. Your garden unit feels like you're looking into the back of people's apartments along Amherst. I'm not sure you need the rectilinear geometry in most of your outdoor courtyard spaces. Maybe that takes up the change in the geometries of the streets, and the buildings front the streets more traditionally. And again, just think about I don't understand this big terrace that's raised from, or lowered from, I can't tell which one, the sidewalk there by that exhibit space. But I think there's a lot of little things you could have done to connect this to the rest of the Wheaton community. I even look at this irregular shaped alley or whatever, and
You're referring to this
yeah,
right here?
yeah.
Okay.
It's like narrow at the opening to the street. I almost wanted to be wide and pull people in there, unless you're saying that the inner space is really reserved only for the residents. But the people, the artists in these storefronts and galleries and exhibits are the ones with the largest market. People coming in to see their stuff.
He's speaking. You gotta hear him.
Oh, okay. I'm just saying.
If we don't hear you in the microphone, it's like going to a Latin mass pre-Vatican II.
Oh, cool.
Okay?
We could do
Those
that.
guys mumbling a language you can't hear.
Okay.
So there's a lot to talk about here. I think it's an interesting project. It's an important project. To me, I like to start, and I kept asking myself, why is this laid out the way it is? Why is the massing done? This is a planning project. It's a powerful site with the way Veers Mill comes into Georgia Avenue. The avenues in Washington, D.C., for better or for worse, as they get outside the city line, are still important thoroughfares. I understand the texture of Georgia Avenue because we did a project just above there, 11141 Georgia. I don't see enough of the urban planning diagram, see what's there to understand why you did what you did. I'm not sure that tower is in the right place. I'm not sure it's oriented properly. There's many ways to do it. I think the key word for me is community and communication of people, of spaces, of buildings, and I see these as being very silo-like. It's an internal space. I agree with the colleague here. I'd rather see things a little more porous, moving away from Georgia. Having this site be something you could move through. I'm not sure that's enough for everyone, and I think your gestures for community are rather tack on. Your creative cubes, your patios, your common houses, they tend to be sort of surface treatments. I don't think that it's deep in its meaning. And I would love to see some communication between the buildings at other levels, not just to come down to grade. If there's ways that certain buildings have certain uses and certain amenities that others would share, and it would bring them to those new communities. Step out of convention.
So before you started, I was talking to your family.
Oh.
And I told them, this is the way that architects talk to each other. Just do. We're very critical of each other.
Thank you for the warning. I was thinking, I'm so glad we had that conversation.
But it's a really good project. Okay. And also, I thought the presentation was very good.
Thank you.
There is a couple of basic questions that I have, besides telling you it's a good project, and a couple of detailed questions that I have. I think whenever you do this sort of thing, there's a courtyard in the middle, you have to be very, very clear about, is it a courtyard only for the people who live there, or is it a courtyard that others can use? And it's not just a question about language, it's a question about architecture. How do you make a statement on the street saying yes or no that others who don't live in here are allowed in? I'm not saying gate it, I'm not saying don't gate it. I'm saying how do you let people know that? So is this only for the people who live here?
The short answer is no.
It's not. Okay. If I am walking down the street, how do I know that?
Along Georgia Avenue,
The reason I say that, the reason I say that, it has been shown that public spaces that are not perfectly clear about are they public or private don't do well. So you have to be clear about it. Sorry, go ahead.
So part of the way I was trying to do that was trying to adjust. As I mentioned before, I had different comments. I received different comments, but adjusting how the buildings, especially on Georgia Avenue, are breaking away from it. I've tried to create more connections, whether it's the additional paths. But I would agree with the jury that additional work could have been done to improve upon that and really to highlight that. Maybe it's an addition of some greater signage, different change in paving patterns, or possibly even more of the orientation of the buildings. The comment towards the orientation of the buildings was stemming back from my original research on the co-housing typology, and really the dominating factor was trying to create a zone of circulation that allowed, and as well as placing all of my communal spaces along that central green space, because that is how the individuals relate. Having all the residents, whether it's in the residential units and living rooms, looking out onto the hallways or look out onto the green space, or it's the common house or the creative cubes that literally engage and penetrate the public space, what I'm deeming the public space, that the green plaza and the upper terrace, and having those things prominent in those spaces to highlight that this is a space that everyone should care about and that everyone should be invited. In future, if I were to do more iterations on it, I think all of your comments are very strong that I would want to continue to develop how could I make that translate from the exterior. I think due to the constraints of just Thesis and the time, I could only really focus on that center space.
Okay. The second comment sort of relates back to that. You showed some really nice diagrams up front, some little axons or perspectives about these little communities, and they had a very casual quality to them, which I found very appealing. And here you have, relied on the geometry of that green in the middle to get at least 3 of the buildings oriented based around that green, as opposed to based on the streets that front them. And I think had you made that a little bit more casual by taking this building up here in the corner and turn it and put it on the street, and then if you had looked at some details like is that the south end?
The south is down, so that's west is to our left.
West to your left. The west end of this building here, if this building was turned and aligned that way, and if this building was set up in a way that I could then design that as a gate, not a gate to be closed off, but architecture at that point that would tell me that this is a public way to get through there. I think right now, just by having a gap between 2 buildings, it doesn't do that. So I would think a little bit more detail about that would be helpful. The other comment, can I make one more comment?
Sure.
The other comment, this goes back to a housing project that my office did for St. Mary's College. And it was 4 buildings around a green. And we made a decision early on to not let anybody to get into their unit without going through the courtyard. It was a way to force interaction. And, they could have, in other schemes, we could have entered directly off the campus trail. We said, no, you have to go in the courtyard. And I was there for the opening of the building, and the president of the college spoke, person in charge of housing spoke, and then a student spoke. And she talked about the forced interaction of how freshmen were living in this dorm and how they met each other. And people from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, very different upbringings, it forced them to meet each other. So I think that can happen. I would not, in this case, for example, let people enter the units off the parking garage. I would force everybody to get up into that courtyard, and not by taking an elevator. There might be a wonderful stair that connects the parking garage up to the courtyard. And then from that courtyard, everybody's going to enter their units from there. No one's going to force the idea that they have to meet each other. My son lives downtown in a building, and I asked him the other day, I said, have you met people there? He said, no. And I said, why not? He says, well, the building just has hallways and doors. There's no lobby. And once again, things like lobbies force people to see each other. So I think in projects like this, you might think about it in terms of you enter your housing unit twice. First, you enter the entire project, just to enter the courtyard, and then from the courtyard, you enter your building.
So in relation to that, which is a very excellent point, again, I sort of go back to my very first comment about the neighborhood, right? How does it, because you also mentioned, you confirmed that you won't be able to filter through the courtyard, filter through your project because they go back and forth. And again, if I'm living here, my only access to your terrace, which when there's a jazz session, as you're showing a wonderful rendering, I want to be a part of, I'm running straight into a parking garage. I can't filter through this to get up there. So I wonder if there's a strategy of breaking these guys up that allows that porosity. So when I'm here, I see a stair that says I'm invited up there visually, and I can sort of go up as opposed to running straight into a parking garage. Where?
Well, yeah, it would be
See what I
the
mean?
lower unit,
Right.
yeah.
And the building should tumble also. I mean,
Exactly.
this incredible topography.
But it's a great project.
This is the first time I've ever had to fight the critics for the microphone. Malik, you know that when you've inflamed the passions of the critics that you've asked an important question. And I think that Malik's career is going to be characterized by asking important questions and working together with the professional community to strive to seek answers to those questions. I think Malik is keenly aware of his potential role in reshaping the environment to improve life for people and their communities. And he's prepared for this role well. He's studied architecture as an undergraduate and done a dual degree combining architecture with urban and community planning as a graduate student. I think that his work reaffirms the value of our dual degrees. And I just want to say that I've had the great pleasure over the last few years to observe and work with Malik in 3 important projects that I think showcase his commitment to improving the world for people. The first of those was React House, where he collaborated with his team really against great odds to design and build University of Maryland's solar decathlon house and take it to victory out in Colorado. Second was getting involved with this thesis project with Malik last year. And third, we got to spend the summer together in St. Petersburg, Russia, working on an urban redevelopment project for that city in collaboration with Russian students and professionals. So through all those projects, I've really seen Malik's leadership not as an individual architect superhero, but as a tremendous collaborator with a really deep commitment to the people and communities that he's going to serve throughout his career. So thanks, Malik.
Oh, you're too kind. Thank you.